possible.
This leads me to the Temple of Wisdom.
Taking a turn for the better.
Let's nip that in the bud and shroud it. I was destined.
As far as I can tell, most of the Genshin community agrees that Tighnari is the strongest standard 5-star character in the game. And honestly, I actually share that sentiment as well. But not only is he really strong, compared to the other standard 5-star characters at least, he's also one of the most fun characters in the game to actually play. And I think that fun factor really skyrockets if you manage to get his C6, which I now have. And so I think to kind of celebrate getting that C6, I wanted to do a guide on Tighnari. Now that being said though, getting his C6 is a bit of a meme in and of itself. Let's break down how you are able to get even a single copy of him, let alone 6 of them. First, you can lose a 50-50 on an event character banner, but then you have to get Tighnari as one of the 8 possible standard characters. Second idea is to roll on the standard banner, in which case if you manage to get a 5-star, he will be one of 18 possible options, that's including the characters and the weapons. The third way is to win the 50-50 on the Sumeru Chronicle banner. Fourth way is actually to lose the 50-50 on the Sumeru Chronicle banner, in which case becomes a 1 in 6 chance. Fifth way is to get him on his original release banner, which, by the way, still hasn't come back. The sixth way, of course, is the yearly free standard 5-star character. And then the seventh way is to also get the +1 Constellation from that particular event that has just started. The first two options, the yearly freebie and of course the +1 Constellation event, are evergreen, but do keep in mind that once you pick him on the Constellation event, apparently you can't pick him again, and there doesn't seem to be a yearly reset on this as far as we know. The Sumeru Chronicle banner is about to disappear, and like I mentioned, his personal banner has only ever appeared once. So yeah, this kinda took me literally years, and even with my spending habits, which, for the record, I'm not exactly a whale, but I do have C4 going to C5 Miko because I really like her, my final constellation actually came in the form of the free standard 5-star. Now before we dig into his kit, I just want to do a quick reminder that if you like this kind of content, then don't forget to hit that like button, and definitely feel free to subscribe because we're dangerously close to 7,000 subs, so I want to thank everyone who has been sticking around since pretty much the start, and you know, Nod Cry has begun, which means we have a lot more things to talk about as that cycle goes. There's also, you know, Abyss runs, Stygian Onslaught. I think we're due for a Warframe update as well at some point. There's also live streams and all that jazz, so hitting that subscribe button, ringing that bell will let you get notified of the latest content on the channel, and if you want to feed the algorithm even more, feel free to smash that hype button. That does seem to be helping quite a lot, so I want to thank everyone who's been doing that as well. Let's remind ourselves of what Tighnari's kit actually entails. First off, his normal attacks are trash, don't worry about them. His charge attacks, on the other hand, are the real source of his damage. So there's two levels. You've got the normal charge attack and the wreath arrows. It takes 3 seconds to fully charge this particular wreath arrow, i.e. there's 1.5 seconds for the normal, and then there's another 1.5 seconds to upgrade that to wreath arrows. Normal charge attacks actually have more upfront talent scaling, but the wreath arrow summons 4 cluster bloom arrows, which I will be referring to for the rest of this video as the micro missiles. At level 9 charge attack, the normal charge attack actually has like 211% talent scaling versus the wreath arrow and missiles, which is 410.6% talent scaling total. Fun fact, the wreath arrow missiles actually don't require a hit. Basically, if you shoot a wreath arrow at the ground, they will then still spawn the micro missiles that will auto-lock to nearby targets. So always fire the wreath arrows. When it comes to Tighnari's skill, it's a grenade. The damage of this particular grenade is completely worthless, but the utility is what you are using it for. First, it creates a taunt field that lasts longer than Mona's Phantom, for example, and it doesn't actually move like Baron Bunny, so it is actually pretty damn useful in my experience. It then reduces the wreath arrow charge time by 2.4 seconds for your next 3 shots. So that 3-second total charge time that I mentioned a little bit earlier, that now becomes 0.6 seconds. This is why he is one of the only fun archers in the game, alongside, like I mentioned before in previous videos, Sethos and, to some extent, Sarah. Now, when it comes to Tighnari's burst, it is missile spam. First, you shoot 6 big arrow missiles, and when they hit targets, each one will spawn an extra missile for 12 total missiles. Now, for some reason, I don't know why, Hoyo decided to give the extra missiles more talent scaling than the big missiles, so they do end up doing a bit more damage. At level 12, which is level 9 plus C3, it's 816% total talent multiplier on the extra missiles versus 667.2% total talent multiplier on the initial missile. So that's kind of the damage difference right there, but it all comes together to become a lot of damage. And finally, when it comes to his passives, his A1 is basically 50 EM for 4 seconds after firing a wreath arrow. It doesn't actually have to hit anything. As soon as you fire it, it is already applied. And his A4 passive is a conversion of his EM to becoming damage percent bonuses up to 60%, by the way, at 1000 EM for his charge attack and his ult. I'll talk about this a little bit later in builds, but let's just say I wouldn't really recommend trying to hit that cap though, but it just means that EM is still a little bit more valuable than other stats. Tighnari is a very quick swappy DPS, but his gameplay loop is very smooth. I normally start off with his skill and then rotate to the rest of his team, but some people may consider chucking in a wreath arrow anyway to get some of that A1 passive. Otherwise, after you've gone through everyone else, wreath arrow spam into burst is usually a good idea, or burst into wreath arrow spam depending on who you are. And usually, if you actually have rotated to the rest of your teammates, you can then use his skill again because that skill only has a 12-second cooldown, so then you can just basically rinse and repeat. His kit screams spread DPS, and it's mainly because of those multiple hit procs. So the spread reaction obviously is a flat damage bonus for the arrow or the missile that triggers that reaction, and because we have some very low talent values on some of this kind of damage, the spread reaction will massively increase the damage that it actually does. Now, that being said though, when it comes to the kind of rotations and combos that you may want to use with Tighnari, it seems to me the more you invest in him, the more nuance there is in those rotations. Like for example, holding your wreath arrows for certain buffs, or potentially even weaving in some scuffed charge attacks. So you're gonna have to figure out something like that. So knowing all of this, who are Tighnari's best teammates? Well, let's have a look at his spread teams to start off with. Nahida, in my opinion, is his best teammate, especially if you have her C2. But even without her C2, the EM buff is still pretty damn huge, and he does have very easy synergy with someone like her. Lauma, on the other hand, can be an alright alternative, but you're mainly using Lauma for the res shred. The rest of her kit basically doesn't get used in a spread team at the very least. Baizhu, being a defensive option, is actually pretty good as well because he's got a passive that can be a somewhat decent buff for someone like Tighnari, and then on top of that, because he's a shielder, he is effectively anti-stagger, which is really useful if you are trying to play an archer like Tighnari and you're trying to aim at someone's head. The same can be said for Ineffa, where this time we're not using most of her kit, kind of like Lauma, but the shield and the EM buff is super duper useful. Just keep in mind that her own damage is going to drop off a cliff. But if you want more damage, then I would suggest Yaoyao Miko, the Wise and Beautiful. I prefer playing Yaoyao Miko with Tighnari over someone like Fischl, because the thing about Fischl is that she can't use anything like Undone Beathai Sinful Hex in a spread team. Spread doesn't count as an electro reaction, and on top of that, you should not be doing normal attacks. The GC Simmers are shoving normal attacks into their various Tighnari teams with Fischl to try and make her seem better, but that's not something that I ever do at all in my experience of playing any Tighnari team, so I don't think that's real. And so therefore, in what I've seen, Yaoyao Miko actually is stronger than Fischl in these teams. And then on top of that, you know, you have that downtime with someone like Tighnari. That would be enough downtime to potentially look into either refreshing Miko's turrets or even dropping her ult for even more damage. So Miko is 100% my preferred pick in these teams. But we also have some other characters who aren't just Dendro and Electro to talk about, mainly Sucrose. She is an EM buffer at the end of the day, so she's still going to be relevant, but she's probably going to be torn between various other teams, especially during Not Cry. There's also C6 Diona, same idea. We've got some EM, we've got some survivability, If anything, she might be a little bit better than Ineffa insofar as, well, at least she actually is using her entire kit and you can actually use Ineffa somewhere else. And then there's Sarah and Ian-san if you want to lean into the attack buffs. The funny thing about Tighnari is that in my experience, it might just be because of how little uptime you really need for someone like Tighnari. You can actually maintain Ian-san's buffs long enough to actually get all of the value on someone like Tighnari. So I wouldn't sleep on using someone like Ian-san with Tighnari. That being said though, I think my favorite hypercarry spread team is still going to be Tighnari, Baizhu, Nahida, and Miko. When it comes to the Quickbloom teams, we first need to talk about the Hydra slot because that one's going to be a little bit tricky. First off, Xingqiu, Yelan, C6 Tighnari is completely out. Tighnari should not be using normal attacks. That's not a thing we do. Mona and Shigvin don't seem to bring enough off-field Hydro, especially Mona, who actually has uptime problems as well. Ayato, Kokomi, and maybe even Aino are probably fine. You will find yourself with some kind of circular impact, so you're going to have to work around that. If you bring Nilou, well, you might as well play a Nilou team at that point, so we're not really talking about that. And then there's Furina, who in my opinion is going to be the best option at the present moment. We'll just have to see what Columbina has in store for someone like Tighnari, in fact. But the main thing that makes Furina really good is that the Salon Solitaire follows you around. It's continuous off-field Hydro. You don't need to do normal attacks for it. It's really good, and also she has a really big buff that works for the entire team, so that's also very, very useful. When it comes to the Dendro slot, same idea as the spread teams, but this time Lauma would be significantly better than Nahida. Even at C2, it does seem to me that Lauma is ever so slightly better than Nahida at least, so I would recommend her. Plus, if you happen to have C1 Lauma, then you also have a healer at that point. Otherwise, Nahida, Baizhu, Yaoyao, these characters are all pretty damn good. And when it comes to the Electro slot, first off, because we're playing with Furina most of the time, then if your Dendro character isn't already a healer, then Shinobu would be my choice. It turns out that she can actually get pretty much all of Furina's fanfare just by herself, so she's actually pretty good for the job. Otherwise, Miko is really good as well. The AoE from the turrets seems to be hitting the bloom seeds to trigger hyper blooms often enough in my experience, and then on top of that, during some downtime, you can always use her normal attacks to do that. Fischl also works as well. She can trigger hyper bloom, but I feel like some enemies might have too large a hitbox that it doesn't really work. It's mainly Undone Be Thy Sinful Hex that actually does it, so it's a little bit finicky there. I think Oz might sometimes shoot the seeds as well. Otherwise, there's always Ineffa, but you're not going to be seeing that much DPS coming out of Ineffa because when you have, let's say, 2 Dendros on the team, yeah, you're not going to be seeing that much of a Hydra aura, and as a direct result of that, you're not going to be seeing that many Thunderclouds, which is going to make Ineffa feel a lot less helpful. And so my most favorite Quickbloom Tighnari team remains as C1 Lauma, Miko, and Furina. This has been working very, very well, especially with my queen. When it comes to building Tighnari, we're actually a little bit spoiled for choice, but for starters, when it comes to his weapons, if you manage to get Hunter's Path, which is his signature weapon, this is still his bestest slot, and as far as I can tell, it's his bestest slot by a somewhat decent margin, so definitely still worth using if you have it. When it comes to using this weapon though, pro tip, I would start with a very quick charge attack in order to get his buff to just start ticking down before you start doing everything else, because there's this weird stipulation in his buff where it lasts for 12 seconds but it only starts after you do a charge attack, so you have to sort of play around that. Otherwise, Astral Vulture's Crimson Plumage is probably his best non-signature weapon. This is of course Chaska's signature weapon. It's really, really good because it buffs both his charge attack and therefore his wreath arrows and also his ult. So that is actually very comprehensive. This is something that Hunter's Path actually doesn't do. But because more of Tighnari's damage is based on his charge attacks, Hunter's Path does end up being a little bit stronger in that regard. There's also Polar Star, which does seem to be a lot better than some people may think. Now, I'm kind of basing the following information off some GC sims that I just tweaked around because I haven't been able to find a proper weapon ranking that someone may or may not have calced and all that jazz. But it seems to me that Polar Star might be stronger than even Astral Vulture's Crimson Plumage. So I don't know for a fact if that's true, but based on just a tweaked sim where I just changed the weapon itself, it seems like Polestar is doing a little bit better. So let me know in the comments how you feel about that. That actually got me really curious because I don't think I've ever seen anyone actively compare Polestar and Hunter's Path. So here I have a comparison just 1-to-1 in the game. Obviously it's not going to be absolutely perfect, but considering that Polestar does need a normal attack on top of the charge attack, skill and ult in order to maximize the attack buff that you're getting from it, assuming I don't change the build, which I didn't, seems to me like they are actually dangerously close in their DPS. Otherwise, you've got First Grade Magic, Aqua Simulacra, other 5-star bows. They're all pretty good on someone like Tighnari. When it comes to the 4-star bows, Scion of the Blazing Sun, being the Battle Pass 4-star, does seem to be his strongest 4-star, despite what some people say being that it's weaker than Slingshot. I don't think it's actually weaker than Slingshot, but again, I'm once again just basing this off the same GC sim where I was just changing the weapon around. Song of Stillness can also work as well, especially if you're bringing a healer. So for example, the Quickbloom team is going to be really good with Song of Stillness. And otherwise, okay, here's a cursed option that I just want to float out there. You could potentially use Sacrificial Bow, because here's the thing. If you manage to not get a reset actually on your first grenade, and you go through the entire team, you do the setup, and then you go through Tighnari's combos, by the time you're done with the combo, you should have your skill ready to go again, in which case you could drop another grenade and then start spamming your wreath arrows. But if that grenade actually procs the Sacrificial Bow reset, then you get to shoot even more arrows by throwing another grenade afterwards. So it could be a lot of fun. It's not necessarily going to be stronger than using Hunter's Path or even Polestar, but I'm just saying it could be a lot of fun to play. When it comes to artifact sets, generally speaking, you're tossing up between Wanderer's Troupe or Gilded Dreams. Both of them seem to work. It's more just going to be the substats. And before anyone gets mad about that, let's just put it this way. When I have a look at the Akasha leaderboards, the reality is there are leaderboards on the Akasha terminal where you can find like 9 builds that are Wanderer's Troupe before you find the number 10 build that is a Gilded Dreams build. But then there's also a leaderboard that I happen to be on, which is the 120 ER build leaderboard, by the way, where the strongest build is a Wanderer's Troupe build, but the second strongest build is a Gilded Dreams one. So it seems to me that in the grand scheme of things, especially if you are using his ult a lot more, yeah, both of these artifact sets are pretty much equal in that regard. Otherwise, if you know that you're going to be playing him as a solo Dendro character, then you should probably put Deepwood on him. That being said, you can put Deepwood on someone else. I would not recommend playing solo Dendro Tighnari in the Great 2025 because, you know, we have so many other characters to play with. Solo Tighnari was really just a thing when he first came out. Otherwise, if you're playing Quickbloom with Furina, for example, then you could also use Marechaussee on Tighnari. Otherwise, I also want to point out Night of the Skies Unveiling. This one might be more of a future set for someone like Tighnari because, you know, we have Lauma, we have Ineffa, hell, Columbina is about to show up, maybe, hopefully, we'll just have to see. I get the feeling that Night of the Skies Unveiling is going to end up being pretty damn strong on Tighnari, so we'll just have to see how that turns out. But when it comes to the artifact stats, this one also gets a little bit nuanced, so it kind of depends on which weapon you're using. If you are using Hunter's Path, then 100% you should stick with EM Dendro Crit. Pretty much, because at that point, it's Hunter's Path that is actually further incentivizing you to use that EM. But if you're using other bows, then it turns out that attack sands and EM sands are pretty much equal, so you can kind of just pick whichever one rolls better. This is also why, even though normally you wouldn't bring an attack buffer to something like an EM scaling DPS, you can bring someone like Ian Sun, or hell, even Bennett if you're super desperate, to a Tighnari team because it actually works out pretty well. When it comes to ER, I personally don't think that you actually need any ER, but if you want a threshold, I've got 120, just a little bit over 120 ER. It seems to be working absolutely perfectly fine for me, so I guess that's kind of the threshold that you can try and aim for if for whatever reason you're coming into energy problems. And when it comes to Tighnari's constellations, obviously having his C6 is huge, but there are of course a few other constellations in there that I've been finding to be very, very useful. So let's just quickly go through it. C1 is extra crit rate for his charge attacks, and I think because it's for his charge attacks, which does seem to be the majority of his damage, not the overwhelming huge majority, but it's still more or less the majority of its damage, I would recommend not building your crit rate past 85%. Even if you're Akasha maxing, for example, I would rather have a bit more crit damage than having a bit more crit rate and then overcapping that crit rate by just a little bit. It just doesn't feel right to me. His C2 is plus 20% Dendro damage after the grenade. In the grand scheme of things, it pretty much lasts for the entirety of your overall experience, provided you haven't just completely killed everything inside the grenade field. C3 is ult levels, wonderful. C5 is grenade levels, completely worthless. C4 is a party-wide EM buff up to 120 total. In pretty much every single team that you're playing with Tighnari, this should be pretty easy to achieve, which makes it very great for some of his off-fielders like Miko, Shinobu, Nahida, Lauma even. Yeah, this is what we call the instructor buff, and it is actually very, very useful as his C4. And finally, we have his C6, which is basically what makes him go from really, really fun to play to probably dangerously one of the most fun characters to play in the game. In fact, I would have to give some serious thought as to whether C6 Tighnari is actually more fun to play than Cloran. I need to actually kind of assess that myself. But either way, what does it do? Well, first off, you actually get an extra missile as part of your wreath arrows, so that's really good. It guarantees an extra spread reaction if, you know, Quicken is actually on the target, so you know, you have even more damage right there. On top of that, your wreath arrow upgrade time gets reduced by 0.9 seconds, which means the total charge time goes from 3 seconds down to 2.1 seconds at base. If you were to then use your grenade, which by the way reduces that total charge time by 2.4 seconds, notice how you end up in negative charge time? That basically means that with C6, your wreath arrows are instant after the grenade for those 3 wreath arrows. So for PC players out there, there is actually a hotkey that you can bind that you can then go into permanent aim mode, and with that you just have to click or whatever it is you do for normal attacks in order to just rapidly fire those wreath arrows. Personally, I prefer still using the click as per normal and running around and sort of aiming like that because it's just more fun to play and I kind of feel better doing that. And another pro tip, you remember what I said about Hunter's Path where you should probably start with a quick charge attack? You should definitely start with a quick charge attack into your skill if you are using C6 R1 Tighnari, because if you try to do a quick charge attack after your skill, you're going to end up throwing out a wreath arrow, which you probably would rather save for, let's say, a buff uptime like Nahida's EM buff as part of her ult. Tighnari at C6 is absolutely ridiculous. His gameplay loop becomes lightning fast and is really, really fun. You've got arrows that you'll be able to fire everywhere. You also have your ult that is just even more arrows. There's so many hits, so many spread reactions, especially with the C6 with an extra spread reaction. We've got some pretty smooth rotations. I think the main thing that might be a little bit of a downer is that sometimes he has a bit of downtime issues because of the fact that you're basically working around those 12-second cooldowns. But either way, we've got a character who's gone from alright, you know, pretty strong for a standard character, but standard characters are typically not that strong, to someone who is probably pretty good in the grand scheme of things. He's not going to be meta at C6, okay? So for the meta nerds out there, no, he's not going to be that kind of a character, but I don't think that really matters, because at least in my experience, he's so much fun that, you know, I still have a really, really good time playing with him now. Let me know what all of this in the comments below. Are you playing C6 Tighnari, or are you working your way towards Tighnari? And what kind of Tighnari team are you enjoying the most? Let me know in the comments. Otherwise, hope you guys enjoyed. If you liked this video, hit that like button, subscribe for more Genshin Impact action, and until next time, I'll see you guys later. Thanks for watching. Bye.